By the time Dr. Gavin Mercer understood that the quiet nurse standing beside the trauma bay knew exactly what was unfolding, the monitors were already shrieking. The room had fallen into that terrible kind of silence that only appears when trained people realize they may have missed something fatal. And every set of eyes in St. Catherine Memorial had turned toward the woman he had spent 6 months overlooking on purpose. Nurse Ileana Vale did not raise her voice, demand attention, or create drama. She moved with the kind of certainty that made room for no argument. In the white-blue wash of Trauma 3, with alarms cutting through the air and a patient's life narrowing by the second, she stepped forward, shifted the respiratory therapist aside with one practiced motion, reached for a pressure cuff with the other, and took command not by volume but by gravity. In 5 words, she silenced the room and forced everyone in it to listen. The patient on the gurney was a broad-shouldered man in civilian clothing, his skin turning gray under fluorescent lights, his pulse thinning, his blood pressure collapsing. 2 minutes earlier, the room had been full of sarcasm, clipped orders, and the ordinary arrogance of people who confuse confidence with competence whenever nothing has gone wrong yet. Now everything was going wrong at once, and the only person who looked truly steady was the nurse many of them had privately labeled soft, fragile, and forgettable. Then the patient opened his eyes, searched past everyone else, found Ileana's face, and whispered a single word too quiet for anyone but the nearest staff to hear. The word was marrow. The room did not understand it. Ileana did. In that instant, the atmosphere inside St. Catherine changed. St. Catherine Memorial stood on the east side of Norfolk, Virginia, not far from the river, and within easy reach of the naval world that shaped so much of the city's hidden rhythm. The hospital had polished floors, donor walls, efficient branding, and a reputation for speed under pressure. It also carried a hierarchy so old and so deeply absorbed into its habits that few people admitted it existed even while obeying it daily. At the top were the surgeons whose credentials and posture announced importance before they spoke. Below them were attending physicians who wore exhaustion as a badge of honor and authority as a natural right. Then came residents, fellows, physician assistants, administrators, specialists, and finally the nurses who kept the entire building functioning while often being treated as though they were merely passing through it. Ileana Vale had worked there for 11 months. She was 32, slight, self-contained, and almost impossible to read unless someone paid close attention to the details others missed. Her dark hair was always pinned back neatly and without vanity. Her charting was exact. Her handoffs were so clean and reliable that several departments quietly preferred her, though few said so openly where ambitious physicians might hear. She never stayed long in the break room circles where resentment became entertainment. She did not flirt, gossip, or try to win people. In a building where so many announced themselves constantly, Ileana moved through each shift like someone who did not need to be noticed to know exactly who she was. Unfortunately, that made her a target. Dr. Gavin Mercer, chief surgical resident, and a man who behaved as though every room existed to confirm his importance, decided during Ileana's first week that he did not like her. No one could identify a single moment that explained it fully. Maybe it was because she never laughed when he mocked other people. Maybe it was because she once corrected him calmly and privately about a medication timing issue, and he could tolerate almost anything except being corrected by someone he considered beneath him. Maybe it was because her silence felt to him less like submission and more like observation. Mercer had the polished face, polished voice, and polished confidence of someone who had spent his whole life being rewarded before he had earned it. He came from money, from recommendation letters that opened doors, from the assumption that if he spoke forcefully enough, the world would rearrange itself around him. He called Ileana a mouse once half under his breath and noticed that 2 interns laughed. From there the names multiplied: quiet nurse, ghost, the weak one. He was too careful to say such things in front of administration, so he relied instead on tone, timing, and public diminishment. He asked her to repeat information she had already given him just to imply she was unclear. He ignored her suggestions when she first made them, then restated them later as his own. He gave her impossible overlaps in assignments and watched with irritated amusement when she still completed them. At first others followed his lead because hospitals, like many high-pressure institutions, often teach people that the safest cruelty is the one already being modeled by someone above them. A resident named Priya Shah did not join in openly, but she did not stop it. Senior nurse Dana Kell, exhausted and practical, mostly kept her head down. 2 young interns laughed too hard because they were frightened of becoming the next target. A physician assistant named Nalan Ruiz watched the pattern with growing disgust and said nothing for longer than he would later forgive himself for. Ileana took every slight with the same composed face. She absorbed sarcasm, dismissal, and carefully calibrated humiliation without giving Mercer the reaction he wanted. That frustrated him more than defiance would have. Even so, there were clues about her long before anyone understood them. The first clue was in her hands. Other nurses noticed it during ordinary work when she secured lines, restocked equipment, or moved through complicated procedures at the end of a 12-hour shift. Her hands never trembled, even when others were hurried or tired. She did not perform calm, she simply possessed it. Her movements were economical in a way more often seen in people trained under stakes higher than civilian impatience. She never fumbled and never dramatized urgency. Watching her sometimes felt like watching someone who had lived in crisis long enough to stop romanticizing it. The second clue came through language. Once, while coordinating an overcrowded corridor, she told transport to hold perimeter on the hall until patient movement cleared, then corrected herself to hallway, as if she had momentarily slipped into a vocabulary she no longer used in civilian life. On another shift, when a combative patient lunged unexpectedly, she repositioned with such swift and controlled awareness that the orderly nearest her stared afterward and asked where she had learned to move like that. She answered only that it came from old training. It was said lightly, but not falsely. The third clue was the silver tag she wore on a chain beneath her scrub top. It almost never showed. Only occasionally, when she bent to lift a box or leaned over a sink, the metal slipped free for a second. It did not look decorative. It looked worn smooth by skin, weather, and years. People noticed. No one asked. Mercer's behavior worsened precisely because Ileana denied him emotional fuel. One morning he walked into the ICU review room, found her already checking pump settings, and announced to the interns that if they wanted to study what low confidence looked like in scrubs, they should observe Nurse Vale. He described her as technically present and spiritually absent, loud enough for nearby families to hear. The interns gave the thin, nervous smiles of people who did not want trouble. Ileana kept documenting. Mercer pressed further, demanding to know whether she had heard him. She answered that she had and then informed him with the same soft steadiness that the Levoft rate in one patient's chart was wrong, that she had already corrected it, and that pharmacy had been paged. A resident by the window looked up at once. Mercer's face tightened. He said that was not an invitation to improvise. Ileana replied that it had been a patient safety issue. The fact that she sounded neither apologetic nor aggressive unsettled him far more than anger would have. Anger he could punish. Calm he could not control. So he shifted from personal ridicule to institutional positioning. He began marking her as difficult in the subtle language administrators love because it leaves no fingerprints. He described her communication style as potentially impairing team fluidity. He called her reserved under pressure. He suggested she was reluctant to escalate. None of it was explicit enough to be cleanly disproven, and that was the point. He denied her trauma rotations by claiming she lacked command presence. He pushed her toward low-prestige assignments, overflow geriatric admissions, repetitive tasks that kept the hospital alive but earned no visibility. He spoke as if some people were simply better suited to quiet corners. Ileana answered once that whoever needed care was where she was useful. That answer should have ended the conversation. Instead, it made him dislike her more. Outside the hospital, Ileana lived alone in a modest brick apartment near Ghent. The place was neat, sparse, and unperformed. A folded navy blanket rested on the couch. 3 medical reference books sat by the window with old bookmarks still tucked inside. A single photograph was usually turned face down. A pair of running shoes waited by the door. At 4:30 most mornings, she ran along the river before daylight had fully arrived. On Saturdays, she drove south to a private training facility outside Chesapeake and spent exactly 47 minutes in the pool. She paid cash. She arrived before the younger athletes. She left before they finished stretching. The owner, a retired rescue diver, once watched her complete 4 underwater laps while holding a weighted brick to her chest, and remarked that she still carried it as if preparing for an extraction. Ileana answered only that maybe she still was. St. Catherine, meanwhile, continued rewarding surface confidence. Mercer was fluent in the hospital's social weather. He remembered donor names, complimented administrators in elevators, and performed empathy with camera-ready precision whenever families were present. The hospital liked what he represented: polish, ambition, speed, elite medicine, the appearance of control. Ileana represented something harder to market. She was quiet competence, and quiet competence does not advertise itself. It waits until the moment performance collapses. That moment began forming on a rainy Thursday when the emergency department overflowed with a freeway pileup, 2 cardiac walk-ins, a kitchen burn case, and a late transfer from a private clinic Mercer resented. Hallways filled with movement. Phones rang. Wheels rattled over tile. Rain struck the ambulance bay doors like impatient fingers. Ileana was covering 2 units because Dana Kell was out sick with pneumonia. Mercer, already irritated, handed Ileana a stack of clipped reports without looking at her and assigned her to triage assist, discharge prep, and cleanup on several beds, then added a remark about trying not to disappear. Ileana pointed out that she was on medications for 2 other patients first. Mercer used that as another chance to belittle her in public, implying that she always needed direction repeated. A family sitting nearby lowered their eyes. Ileana answered that she understood and kept moving. As she turned away, Mercer remarked that maybe one day they would promote her to speaking before it was too late. Nalan Ruiz finally muttered that the comment had been unnecessary. Mercer shrugged and said that if she could not handle comments, she could not handle trauma. Across the station, Priya Shah watched Ileana walk away at the same measured pace as always, as if humiliation were weather and not something worth negotiating with. Later that same week, near midnight, security brought in an intoxicated patient in handcuffs after a bar fight. He was large, aggressive, and assigned only one orderly. Mercer was in the room and clearly annoyed by the delay. When the patient jerked upright and swung an elbow toward the nearest tray stand, everyone flinched except Ileana. She pivoted once, caught the line cart before it toppled, adjusted her stance, and used a low, controlled tone to redirect the man's attention without escalating him. The entire exchange lasted only seconds. Security regained control. One intern stared at her afterward and asked how she had done that. Ileana simply explained that people showed where they were going if you stopped panicking long enough to see it. Mercer dismissed the moment as nothing more than managing a drunk, but in the locker room, Dana Kell quietly observed that it had not looked like ordinary nursing reflex. Ileana agreed that it had not. Another clue surfaced in records. An older clerk named Marion noticed unusual classification tags in Ileana's personnel file while processing continuing education documents. There were references to civilian bridging, specialized field medicine certification, and certain pages sealed under institutional waiver. Marion assumed it involved a military transfer history and left it there, but in a place like a hospital, even fragments develop gravity. Soon there were whispers that Ileana had worked overseas, that she had done humanitarian work near conflict zones, that she might have embellished her experience, or that she was simply private. Mercer heard the rumors and dismissed them. In his worldview, if someone had done anything genuinely impressive, the building would already know. Excellence, as he understood it, was visible, self-advertising, and comfortable with hierarchy because it expected to sit near the top of it. He could not imagine a truly capable person choosing restraint. To him, silence was evidence of smallness. He was wrong in a way that would become expensive. The first major crisis arrived on a Sunday at 3:17 in the afternoon when the hospital received a call from a private security convoy. The report described a male patient in his mid-40s wearing civilian clothes, with severe hypotension and penetrating upper thoracic trauma already stabilized in the field. There had been transport delays, limited disclosure, and a demand for immediate trauma bay access. The phrasing was unusual enough to catch attention. Private security convoys did not talk like that unless they were intentionally avoiding more formal language. Limited disclosure meant the patient mattered. The speed and quietness of the notification chain suggested the same. Mercer saw the note and straightened as though fate had finally chosen to center him. Without waiting for formal assignment, he declared that he would lead Trauma 3. Ileana was restocking nearby when she heard the report. Her expression barely changed, but Nalan Ruiz, who had grown better at reading subtler things, saw something sharpen behind her eyes. The convoy arrived without sirens. 2 dark SUVs and an unmarked sedan pulled in. Men in plain clothes scanned the ambulance entrance as though trusting neither walls nor routines. The patient came in under a thermal blanket, oxygen already running, his shirt cut open, chest wrapped, left shoulder bruised, skin too pale. He was heavily built, muscular despite blood loss, and carried the old scars of a life not spent behind desks. One medic gave clipped information and only what was necessary. The listed name was Daniel Cross. Allergies were unknown. Consciousness had been intermittent. he had declined sedation. Mercer demanded a mechanism of injury and received a frustratingly vague reply about a fall with impalement risk avoided. He bristled at the lack of detail and insulted the medic's secrecy, but the medic remained unmoved. Liana stepped to the bedside and began assessing vitals with quiet speed. Blood pressure was low and still falling. Respiratory effort was compromised without outright failure. Perfusion was poor. There was asymmetry at the upper chest, subtle but wrong. She looked at the monitor, the dressing, and the patient's neck. The story did not fit the physiology. Mercer began issuing standard trauma orders in a commanding tone designed as much for the audience as the patient. Fluids, imaging prep, labs, workflow. It looked competent at first glance. Priya verified access. Nolan reached for the portable ultrasound. Ileana noted the neck veins and told Mercer there might be tamponade physiology developing. Mercer dismissed her warning with a sneer disguised as confidence, implying she had learned too much from the internet. Ileana, unoffended, pointed out the dropping pressure, dampened heart sounds, and the need for immediate reassessment before transport. Mercer leaned over the patient and accused her of dramatizing routine trauma. He said they were not going to perform operating room theater in the bay because she was nervous. Then the monitor changed. Pressure dropped again. Heart rate spiked. The patient's color worsened. He tried to speak and could not. Mercer called for more fluids. The room's rhythm fractured. Everyone felt the shift even before they understood it. Ileana noticed a new dark bloom spreading under the edge of the chest dressing and told Mercer to stop. He ignored her. She told him more directly to scan the patient now. Mercer turned toward her, poised for public humiliation, and ordered her not to challenge his call in front of his team. At that moment, the patient seized Mercer's sleeve weakly, turned his face toward Ileana, and whispered the word marrow. That word struck Ileana like a signal pulled from deep water. It was not a name in the ordinary sense. It was a call sign from another life, one known only by a few people who had seen her in situations far from civilian hospitals. She looked closely at the patient's face, and the disguise of years, civilian grooming, and injury fell away. Daniel Cross was not Daniel Cross. He was Commander Nathan Rourke, older now and changed by time, but unmistakable once truly seen. He was a man who had once led teams through conditions impossible to describe casually and had brought people home by refusing to panic. He recognized her. He had remained aware enough to use the one word that would cut through everything. Ileana took the ultrasound probe from Mercer's hand. She did not snatch, shove, or argue. She simply removed it with the kind of certainty that makes resistance feel childish. Nolan turned the machine toward her immediately. Priya cleared the field. Mercer began to protest, but the screen lit and revealed the truth. Fluid was compressing the heart. Tamponade was developing fast. For one heartbeat, the room stared at undeniable evidence Mercer had refused to look for. Liana announced the diagnosis and ordered preparation for immediate intervention, cardiothoracic consult, and attending trauma. Nobody questioned her command presence then. Priya went for the phone. Nolan called overhead. The respiratory therapist repositioned. An intern almost dropped a supply pack because his hands were shaking. Mercer stood frozen for a fraction too long. Ileana leaned close to Rourke and kept him tethered with the same steady focus she brought to everything. He recognized her presence, managed a breath of acknowledgement, and drifted again. Mercer attempted to recover authority by insisting on transfer to procedure under his control. Ileana refused without looking at him and said that physiology, not ego, was deciding the timeline now. That sentence remained in the memory of everyone who heard it. Less than a minute later, attending trauma surgeon Dr. Lena Corbett entered, saw the ultrasound, saw the vitals, and asked. Ed, who had caught it. Mercer opened his mouth, but Priya answered first and gave the credit where it belonged. Corbett did not waste further words. Under her command, the bay snapped back into useful order. Ileana anticipated equipment before requests were completed, relayed numbers clearly, and moved with the efficiency of someone for whom crisis was not an interruption but an environment. When one intern froze while priming a line, she took over, finished the task in seconds, and returned it without fanfare. Mercer tried twice to reassert himself and was ignored because at the edge of catastrophe, even political rooms still recognize competence. Rourke survived the critical window, was stabilized enough for controlled transfer, and reached surgery without crashing in transit. After the doors closed behind the team taking him upstairs, Trauma 3 exhaled as if the room itself had been holding its breath. Mercer stood at the sink washing hands he had barely used. Priya looked at Ileana as if discovering that a locked door in a familiar hallway led to an entire hidden wing. Nalan finally asked how she had known. Ileana said only that the patient had told her what she needed to remember. Mercer snapped that it was not an answer. For the first time that day, Ileana looked directly at him and replied that it had been the only answer he had time for. Within an hour, the story began moving through St. Catherine faster than any official memo. The quiet nurse had identified a life-threatening complication before the chief resident did. The attending had credited her openly. The patient had known her. She had handled the ultrasound like someone whose experience reached far beyond bedside nursing. Dana Kell found Ileana in supply recovery and asked who the man really was. Ileana answered only that he was a patient. Dana pressed once more, and Ileana repeated it with unkindness absent but finality present. The truth was that Ileana had spent years building a life where she did not have to explain herself. Civilian nursing was supposed to be simple in the best sense of the word: service, structure, healing without classified shadows. She had not come to St. Catherine to become known. She had come there to work. The hospital, however, chose self-protection before gratitude. Mercer moved first. Before dawn the next morning, he filed an incident report framing the trauma event as a breakdown in team hierarchy caused by unauthorized nursing intervention. He did not deny the diagnosis. He did not deny the urgency. He simply suggested that Ileana had created confusion, undermined physician leadership, and destabilized the room. The language was careful, dishonest, and built to survive. By 9 o'clock, Ileana had been called into Administration Room B, a space with soft chairs and harbor watercolors designed to make institutional harm feel civil. Human Resources Representative Jill Fenwick sat beside Nursing Operations Manager Paul Hendricks, who already looked apologetic. Mercer was there too. Ileana took her seat and listened while Fenwick explained that there were concerns she had exceeded role boundaries during a high-risk intervention. Ileana answered that there had been a patient in imminent physiological collapse. Mercer spoke of process, authority, and her supposed pattern of restrained oppositional communication. Fenwick asked whether Ileana had taken the ultrasound probe from Mercer without permission. Ileana answered yes and added that permission had not been the relevant issue. She explained that the patient had been deteriorating and that delay would have increased risk. Mercer insisted she had destabilized authority. Ileana replied that if authority could not tolerate life-saving correction, then the problem was not correction. The calm force of that sentence unsettled the room, but not enough to stop what came next. By noon, Ileana had been placed on temporary review status pending procedural investigation. She was removed from trauma assignment and ordered to complete professional communication remediation. The rumor spread before the memo did. The nurse who had just helped save an important patient was being written up for tone. Nalan Ruiz nearly threw the notice away in disgust. Priya Shah read it twice and confronted Mercer directly, telling him that he knew it was garbage and that Ileana had been right. Mercer answered that right people could still behave inappropriately and reminded Priya that he was still in a position to shape which version became official. That sentence frightened her more than open anger would have. It revealed that he understood exactly what he was doing. Ileana was assigned to discharge education and intake documentation on the lowest acuity floor. It was punishment so obvious that everyone recognized it. Patients and families who had seen her in the crisis treated her warmly. Some staff became awkward around her, uncertain whether support for her might be risky. Dana Kell C. ordered Hendricks and asked how the hospital could possibly be reviewing the one person who had held the trauma bay together. Hendricks gave the empty institutional answer that there were allegations. Dana replied that there was evidence. He said there was also hierarchy. She looked at him in a way that promised she would remember that answer. Ileana kept doing her job. She explained medication tapers to frightened elderly patients, adjusted a postpartum support pillow for a new mother, and found time to comfort a janitor whose wife was in oncology. She did not complain. Her dignity made the injustice feel worse because anger would have given bystanders somewhere safer to stand. Dignity forced them to hear themselves. That evening, Ileana tried to check on Rourke but found his chart restricted and a private detail posted near the corridor. One of the men gave her a nearly invisible nod that acknowledged recognition and promised silence. She left without drawing attention. In the locker room, one of the interns who had laughed at Mercer's jokes, Lucas Brenner, admitted that he should have spoken up sooner. Ileana answered, gently but with no softness toward false comfort, that he had not told himself it was none of his business. He had told himself it was safer. The accuracy of that landed harder than any accusation. Lucas apologized. Ileana told him to learn faster next time. At home that night, she turned over the photograph she usually kept face down. It showed 5 people near a coastal airstrip beneath a copper sunset. 3 men in field gear, 1 woman in rescue fatigues, and a younger Ileana whose face carried the kind of narrow, disciplined focus that belongs to people trained to decide under pressure when the margin for error is almost gone. On the back were 3 faded words, for those returning. She sat with the photograph in her hands while rain moved against the balcony door. Years earlier, after a mission had gone wrong because of systems, ego, and delayed truth rather than lack of skill, she had chosen civilian medicine over classified service. She wanted a life where saving someone did not require silence afterward. Somehow silence had followed her anyway. The investigation deepened the next day. Mercer gave formal statements emphasizing policy breach, nursing overreach, and emotionally reactive conduct inconsistent with trauma protocol. Witnesses were interviewed. One orderly, frightened for his job, claimed events had moved too fast for certainty. An intern said much the same. Priya Shah gave a direct account stating that Ileana had identified a critical condition before Mercer and had acted appropriately under time pressure. Nalan Ruiz was blunter, explaining that if authority meant the right to be wrong while others stayed quiet, then yes, Ileana had undermined it. Dana Kell advised administration to ask the attending who saved the patient and end the meeting there. Unfortunately, Dr. Corbett was in surgery all day, which gave Mercer time. He used it well. In the physician's lounge, he spread a softer but equally dishonest version of events. In that version, Ileana was a nurse with an unclear background, questionable boundaries, and a habit of inserting herself. He wrapped all of it in the language of concern because concern is one of the most socially accepted disguises for self-protection. A senior anesthesiologist remarked that she had seemed highly useful the previous month. Mercer replied that useful was not the same as stable under command. Across the room, someone murmured that Mercer himself had never seemed especially stable under correction, but the comment was too quiet to matter. Ileana kept working. On floor 2, she found a confused veteran trying to climb out of bed during an alarm test. He was disoriented and triggered by the sound. 2 aides approached too quickly and made him worse. Ileana dimmed the lights, shifted the angle of the room by moving a chair, and lowered her voice until his breathing slowed. When he asked whether she had been military, she answered only that not today. He laughed weakly, somehow understanding more than the words alone. Then came the most public humiliation of the week. In the busiest corridor between emergency and imaging, Mercer stopped Ileana in front of staff, patients, visitors, and families and held out a disciplinary acknowledgement form. He wanted witnesses. He wanted spectacle without seeming theatrical. Ileana read the form fully before signing receipt, not admission. When she handed it back, Mercer wore a smile of neat professional victory. Ileana replied clearly enough for those nearby to hear that paperwork could not reverse physiology. Several people inhaled sharply. Mercer's expression emptied. Ileana walked away without raising her voice, crying, or arguing. The silence she left behind exposed him more than any scene would have. By the end of that day, Hendricks warned her that leadership might recommend probation if she were deemed unsuited for collaborative trauma environments. The wording was so absurd she almost smiled. Almost. That night she opened a lockbox in the back of her closet. Inside were expired credentials, field medicine records, maritime extraction certifications, a commendation letter with most of its text redacted, and 1 folded fabric patch carrying the call sign Marrow in subdued stitching. She held the patch for a long time, then returned it to the box. She still had no intention of using any of it unless she absolutely had to. The next morning, real authority entered St. Catherine without ceremony. A black sedan pulled into the staff lot. Out stepped Rear Admiral Thomas Vance, retired but now serving in an oversight role tied to Federal Medical Liaison for Defense-Sensitive Care. With him came Commander Elise Morneau, a legal compliance liaison carrying a leather portfolio. They asked for the hospital director. Not urgently, not loudly, just calmly. That made their arrival far more unsettling. Executive Director Marjorie Bell met them in a conference suite with the controlled concern of someone who did not yet know whether the problem was legal, political, or reputational. Vance requested a private update on the restricted patient, access to the event chain documentation, and a list of all personnel involved in the initial stabilization. When Bell asked whether there was a problem, Vance answered that it depended on what her records showed. The atmosphere in the building shifted almost immediately. Administrators walked faster. Security became visible but discreet. HR stopped smiling automatically. Mercer heard that federal oversight tied to the patient was in the building and fatally assumed this would elevate anyone associated with the case, especially him. He changed ties before going upstairs. In the step-down unit, Nathan Rourke was conscious, pale, and alive. He looked more ordinary than men like him ever really are, but the private detail outside his room stepped aside the moment Vance arrived. Vance observed that Rourke looked terrible. Rourke replied with the dry endurance of someone who had survived enough to insult back on principle. Once the room was secured, Vance asked whether he had identified a nurse during intake. Rourke confirmed that he had named Ileana Vale and that he had used her call sign deliberately. He said he had been aware enough in the trauma bay to hear how the room treated her and knew there would be consequences. He also made clear that she had saved his life. Downstairs, Mercer prepared to shine. He approached Bell, Hendricks, and Fenwick with a polished offer to clarify the chain of care. He framed his involvement as leadership under pressure. Before anyone responded, Vance appeared in the corridor. Mercer extended a hand and introduced himself as the chief surgical resident leading the bay. Vance did not take the hand. He asked Bell whether this was the man. Bell confirmed Mercer's role. Vance said they would review the records before hearing interpretation. The absence of visible contempt made the dismissal sharper. While that was unfolding, Ileana was on a lower floor teaching a patient how to manage a post-operative drain. She had no idea Vance was in the building. Upstairs, Morneau and Vance read Mercer's incident report and immediately noticed the gap between his framing and witness statements already collected. Interviews followed. Priya Shah did not hedge. Nalan Ruiz was even less diplomatic. Dana Kell described the long pattern of belittling behavior Mercer had directed at Ileana. Lucas Brenner corrected his own silence in public and explained that the room had not merely failed once. It had been trained over months to discount her, so when she spoke with certainty, it only felt disruptive because people had been conditioned to ignore her. When Morneau asked who had trained them that way, Lucas answered with the name everyone already knew. Dr. Lena Corbett came in straight from surgery and confirmed, without softening it, that Ileana had identified the tamponade and Mercer had delayed reassessment. She added that if the hospital was considering disciplining the nurse who caught what the resident missed, then the institution had a more dangerous problem than a protocol dispute. Ego with cover, she said, eventually kills someone. Mercer still knew none of this. He spent the morning refining his defense, tightening his language, and seeking advice from a mentor who told him to emphasize procedural consistency and avoid emotional framing. It was sensible advice and far too late. Shortly after 11, Hendricks asked Ileana to come to an executive conference room. She expected further administrative pressure. Instead, she found Vance, Morneau, Corbett, and Bell waiting. Vance addressed her by name with the calm recognition of someone confirming a long-buried fact. Bell, already unsettled, explained that information relevant to the matter had emerged at the hospital. Al had not previously possessed. Ileana answered that this had generally been her preference. When Bell carefully asked about the call sign, Ileana looked to Vance before answering, not out of fear, but to assess how much had already been disclosed. Vance told her that Rourke had revealed very little, but enough. Ileana then explained in clear and restrained terms that before civilian licensure she had served in a joint special operations medical support capacity attached to maritime recovery and personnel extraction. Her work had involved field stabilization, extended care under hostile conditions, and retrieval support in denied environments. Bell stared. Hendricks nearly dropped the coffee he had just carried into the room. Corbett's face shifted into the look of someone suddenly fitting old pieces together. Morneau asked for the call sign. Ileana answered that it was Marrow. The word seemed to settle into the room like a truth people had to adjust around. Morneau opened a document wallet and placed forward the limited records that could be shown. Federal validations, advanced field medicine commendations, specialized extraction support history, cross-trained certifications beyond ordinary civilian pathways. Bell read in stunned silence. Hendricks whispered why Ileana had never said any of this. Ileana answered that she had applied for a nursing job, not a legend. Vance explained that years earlier, during a maritime interdiction crisis that had gone catastrophically off-script, Ileana had kept multiple wounded operators alive for 19 hours under diminishing resources and extreme conditions after command failures elsewhere had made matters worse. Rourke had been one of those operators. Morneau added that Ileana's trauma judgment under instability was considered exceptional by people who did not use that word casually. Bell asked the obvious question, which was why someone with that background had come to bedside nursing in a civilian hospital. Ileana answered simply that saving one person in a clean room still mattered, that ordinary care was not lesser care, and that she had wanted a life where healing did not have to be wrapped in secrecy. Bell then confronted the embarrassment of having allowed the institution to place this woman under review for seeing what a resident had missed. Vance did not soften that embarrassment. He said the problem extended beyond one resident. Ileana, true to form, did not ask for vengeance or spectacle. She asked for the record to be corrected truthfully, and for the staff who had been trained into silence to see that silence was not always the safest choice. Bell asked whether Ileana had ever truly been weak. Ileana replied that she had been tired and that people confused the two all the time. Mercer was summoned to another conference room shortly after noon. He walked in expecting at worst a difficult review and at best a chance to reclaim the narrative. Instead, he found Bell, Fenwick, Hendricks, Vance, Morneau, Corbett, and Ileana seated at the table. Something inside him faltered the moment he saw her there under different light. Morneau asked whether he stood by the claim that Ileana had been emotionally reactive and destabilizing during the trauma intake. Mercer said yes, within context, because her conduct had undermined team coherence. Corbett stated flatly that this was false. Mercer tried to argue that she had entered after the disruption, and Corbett replied that she had entered in time to see a nurse who had already identified what he had missed and a resident more interested in preserving authority than receiving correction. Vance then asked whether Mercer knew who the patient was and whether he understood the patient's relationship to Ileana. Mercer did not. Morneau opened the folder and set before him enough verified context to collapse his version of events. She did not expose classified details. She did not need to. There was prior advanced trauma expertise, documented trust recognition from the patient, independent witness statements, an attending's clinical confirmation, and clear contradictions between Mercer's report and what had actually happened. Mercer read the pages, then read them again as if the language itself had betrayed him. When he looked up, the composure he had worn so confidently all year had started to fracture. He said none of this had been in her personnel profile. Bell answered coldly that it had not needed to be. Mercer then looked at Ileana and accused her of letting this happen, meaning that she had allowed people to misjudge her. Ileana asked quietly what exactly he thought she had permitted. He gestured, unable to articulate his own indictment clearly, and said that people had not known who she was. Ileana replied with devastating simplicity that no, people had decided. Mercer attempted one final defense. Even if Ileana had unusual experience, he argued, protocol still mattered and nurses could not freelance based on hidden B. Backgrounds, Morneau agreed that protocol mattered and turned directly to protocol itself. She pointed out that protocol had required reassessment when the patient deteriorated, that Ileana had requested it, and that Mercer had refused. Protocol had required accurate documentation, and his report had materially mischaracterized both her conduct and his delay. Fenwick asked him directly whether he had knowingly framed her intervention in order to shield himself from accountability. He denied it. Bell, Corbett, and Morneau all knew the denial was worthless. Bell informed him that he was being removed from supervisory trauma leadership pending full review. He protested that such action could not be based on one event. Morneau then placed a second file on the table. Witness statements describing a pattern of belittling conduct, documentation irregularities, and earlier concerns that had never been escalated because staff feared retaliation. Priya had spoken. Nolan had spoken. Lucas had spoken. Dana had spoken. Even Marion from records had noted unusual selective notation patterns after comparing dates. Mercer looked from face to face and understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that the room no longer revolved around his confidence. A formal internal hearing was scheduled that afternoon in the small auditorium usually reserved for education and compliance sessions. It was not public theater, but it was not private either. Department leaders, HR, compliance staff, and relevant witnesses attended. Word spread. By the time people took their seats, everyone knew something consequential was happening. Mercer sat on one side with the brittle expression of a man trying to remain indignant in the face of accumulating facts. Ileana sat on the other in navy scrubs, shoulders straight, uninterested in performing victimhood. Bell opened the hearing by summarizing the issue, conflicting accounts of a critical trauma event, concerns about professional conduct, and potential misuse of reporting structures. Then she did something St. Catherine rarely did. She read aloud the original disciplinary notation against Ileana. Heard in public, the language sounded exactly as petty and distorted as it truly was. Bell then read the amended clinical reconstruction based on monitor logs, staff statements, and attending review. Step by step, second by second, the record replaced Mercer's preferred fiction. Ileana had identified signs of tamponade. She had requested reassessment. Mercer had declined. Ileana had then performed ultrasound assessment under exigent circumstances, confirming the condition later validated by the attending. No rhetoric was needed. In serious environments, sequence is enough. A staff advocate asked whether Ileana's prior elite experience might have biased perceptions afterward. Morneau answered immediately that the clinical validity of her assessment had existed before anyone in the room knew her background. The point ended there. Witnesses were called. Priya stated that Ileana had been calm and Mercer dismissive. Nolan said plainly that if Ileana had obeyed Mercer's ego, the patient's odds would have worsened. Dana said that everyone in the unit knew Mercer targeted her because she would not flatter him. Lucas rose last among the staff witnesses and nearly shook through his opening words, but then he looked at Ileana and chose adulthood in front of everyone. He admitted that he had laughed at comments about her before the event. He asked for that to be on the record because he wanted the room to understand how environments are built. Mercer had not created every silence. Others had helped by normalizing his behavior, by making it easier to ignore the correct person because she did not package herself like the people they had been trained to follow. Bell then asked whether Ileana wished to make a statement. The auditorium grew still. Ileana stood beside her chair and spoke in the same voice she had used with frightened families and failing patients. She said that she had come to St. Catherine to work, not to be extraordinary, and that she had asked only that when she spoke about a patient in danger, people listened to the content instead of measuring the status of the person speaking. She explained that she had not been punished for lacking skill but because a hierarchy had felt embarrassed, and that those were not the same thing. If institutions continued confusing them, someone kinder, younger, or less stubborn than she was would eventually pay the price. She said the issue was not making quiet people special. It was stopping the system from making quiet people invisible. When she sat down again, there was nothing Mercer could say that would meet the moral clarity of it. When his turn came, he offered the familiar blend of self-preservation and thin contrition. He spoke of communication breakdown, denied targeted hostility, and insisted he had been trying to preserve standards. He regretted only tea. The way things had been perceived. Corbett nearly laughed. Bell did not. By the end of the hearing, Ileana's disciplinary notation was voided and expunged. Her performance record was formally corrected to reflect exemplary clinical judgment under pressure. Mercer was removed from resident leadership responsibilities pending external review of his conduct, documentation practices, and retaliatory behavior. His fellowship track was suspended. A broader culture review was launched across emergency and trauma operations. Bell also ordered the development of a protocol ensuring any staff member could escalate urgent patient concerns without fear of role-based humiliation. Then Rear Admiral Vance stood and spoke briefly. He said that in every serious environment he had ever served, failure rarely began with ignorance. It began when pride trained a room which voices could be safely ignored. That was not strength, he said. It was rot. He added that some of the finest people he had known never once announced themselves before doing what duty required, and that if St. Catherine had mistaken restraint for weakness, then it had been given a warning at acceptable cost and should learn from it. He sat down. No one in the room moved for several seconds. After the hearing, staff drifted through the corridors more quietly than usual. Shame and relief mixed in uneven proportions. Some people did not know how to approach Ileana at all. Lucas stopped her near the stairwell and admitted he did not expect forgiveness. Ileana told him not to expect it, but to expect responsibility. Priya later asked why Ileana had never simply told people who she had been. Ileana answered that if respect only arrived after a glamorous backstory, then it was not really respect for judgment. Priya had no answer. Mercer, meanwhile, went to Bell's office demanding reconsideration and claiming stress, scapegoating, and unfairness. He spoke as though Ileana's hidden history had somehow been deployed against him rather than merely existing beside his own failures. Bell let him speak briefly before telling him that the hospital had not failed because Nurse Vale had a concealed past. It had failed because he believed his own past entitled him to dismiss other people in the present. For the first time in a very long time, Mercer's charm found nowhere to land. The aftermath was not magical healing. Vindication rarely restores trust instantly. The following week felt like sunlight entering a room that had not been cleaned properly in years. It illuminated everything. Staff who had once laughed too easily became careful. Administrators who had hidden behind procedure realized procedure could expose them as easily as protect them. Ileana returned to trauma service by unanimous clinical recommendation. No one framed it as a favor. On her first shift back, under a pale gold sunrise over the hospital glass, a respiratory therapist gave her a nod containing actual respect. Dana Kell handed her a tablet and remarked that it was good to have the best pair of hands in the building back where they belonged. Ileana replied dryly that the sentiment sounded suspicious. Priya Shah soon admitted she wanted to observe more of Ileana's decision process during unstable cases. When Ileana asked whether that was a request for teaching, Priya answered that it was a request not to be stupid twice. Nathan Rourke improved steadily. When Ileana entered his room as part of a routine check with another nurse present, he looked at her with the tired humor of someone who had woken up in too many unfamiliar rooms and survived enough to hate fluorescent lighting on instinct. Their exchange remained understated, shaped by roles and privacy, but the history in the room was unmistakable. Rourke acknowledged that he should not have used the call sign. Ileana made it clear that he had created complications by doing so. He admitted that he had done it anyway because he had heard how people in the Bay spoke to her and could not tolerate hearing the voice that had once kept his team alive treated as background noise. Ileana, even then, refused to center herself fully. She reminded him that the whole team had moved once the truth became visible. It was a generous interpretation of events, and he knew it. Before she left, he repeated the phrase written on the back of the old photograph, "For those returning." Ileana paused, acknowledged it with the smallest nod, and left. In the hallway, Rear Admiral Vance waited near a window and offered her a role in a federal trauma systems training initiative. The position would have brought better pay, greater recognition, and far less daily indignity. Ileana declined. Vance asked whether she meant the refusal seriously. She told him she was staying because there were people inside St. Catherine who still needed to learn what competence sounded like when it was not wrapped in ego. Vance approved in the quiet way of men who respect difficult choices more. Hand flashy ones. Marjorie Bell asked Ileana for a private meeting, and to her credit, apologized without padding the words. She admitted that the hospital had failed her institutionally, and that she herself had failed to notice the culture thriving beneath polished surfaces. Ileana accepted the apology with more grace than Bell deserved. Bell then asked whether Ileana would help design the new escalation protocol training. Ileana noted, not unreasonably, that the hospital was now asking the person it had nearly disciplined to fix the culture that had allowed it. Bell accepted the point and still asked. Ileana agreed on one condition: participation from frontline staff had to be protected from retaliation and not filtered through resident leadership. Bell accepted immediately. The training sessions that followed were unlike the hospital's usual compliance performances. They were real. They used actual scenarios, actual pauses, and actual conversations about tone, hierarchy, interruption, doubt, and the ease with which a room turns dangerous when pride decides whose observations count. Ileana did not speak about classified work. She did not need to. She taught from patient physiology, communication under strain, and the principle that facts do not become more or less true depending on the title attached to the person speaking them. Attendance was mandatory. Attention for once was voluntary and intense. During one session, Lucas asked what someone should do if hierarchy in the moment made them doubt their own accurate observation. Ileana answered that they should name the observation, not the fear, because specifics were harder to dismiss. The sentence stayed. Nolan later told Dana that it deserved to be painted on a wall. Dana suggested, less charitably, that it might serve better on Mercer's car. Mercer's review concluded in stages. He was not destroyed publicly because real consequences are often less theatrical and more durable. His leadership track ended. Letters of recommendation disappeared. The fellowship once considered inevitable went elsewhere. He remained under remediation long enough to understand that talent without trust becomes a lonely and unstable currency. People stopped orbiting him. For a man like Mercer, that may have been the deepest punishment. He eventually transferred to a smaller program out of state. There was no newspaper scandal. No grand public ruin, only a narrowing of doors and the burden of rebuilding a reputation in rooms no longer inclined to assume he deserved one. Ileana never celebrated his downfall. That was never the point. She kept working. Through summer heat and the endless human procession that moves through hospitals every day, she made St. Catherine safer by increments that would never fit into a dramatic headline. Stories collected around her anyway. New hires arrived having already heard fragments. There was a trauma nurse who had once worked in places no one could explain clearly. There was a nurse who stayed calm when monitors screamed and a decorated commander had recognized with one whispered word. There was a nurse who had been mocked until the record turned around and answered for her. Most versions were exaggerated. Ileana ignored them, but she no longer made herself smaller for other people's comfort. She took space when the work required it. She corrected errors without apology. She looked uncertain interns and young nurses in the eye and asked what they were seeing until they learned to trust their own perceptions. One autumn evening, St. Catherine held a quiet donor reception in the atrium for trauma system improvements and veteran care outreach. Ileana tried to avoid attending, but Belle insisted that her presence mattered. Ileana compromised by wearing a simple dark blue dress and standing near the back where she hoped to disappear. The atrium glowed amber beneath soft lights. City reflections moved across glass. Conversations drifted in polite currents. Then attention shifted toward the entrance. Nathan Rourke had arrived in a black suit, healthy enough now to carry himself with the same contained gravity he always had. Rear Admiral Vance entered with him. The room reacted instinctively, preparing to honor visible power. Rourke thanked Belle, acknowledged the care team, and then let his gaze pass over directors, surgeons, donors, and honored guests until it stopped exactly where Ileana stood near a column. He crossed the atrium without haste. The room watched. Ileana set down her untouched, sparkling water and turned to face him with the same unadorned steadiness she had carried into every crisis. Rourke stopped in front of her, inclined his head, and addressed her by the call sign Marrow, not loudly, but with enough weight that the nearest circle heard and everyone else felt it. Awe moved through the room. It was not the word alone that mattered. It was the recognition inside it, the unmistakable fact that a man the institution was eager to. Honor had chosen first to honor the woman it had almost taught itself to ignore. Ileana answered with equal calm, acknowledging him as commander. Then Rourke did something no one in the atrium expected. He stepped back, straightened fully, and offered her a salute exact in form and utterly free of theatrics. It was not for the room. It was not ceremonial display. It was professional respect from one person shaped by impossible ground to another who had carried others through it. Belle saw it. Priya saw it with tears she would later deny. Lucas saw it and understood, perhaps permanently, how badly he had once misread what strength looked like. Even those who knew none of the history felt the truth of the gesture. Ileana did not answer with a full military return. That life was behind her. Instead, she placed one hand lightly over her heart and gave a small nod that held memory, grief, service, and peace all at once. Later in the evening, a young nurse hired only 2 weeks earlier approached Ileana near the courtyard doors and nervously admitted that hearing pieces of what had happened had helped her. It mattered, she said in essence, to know that a person could be quiet in that building and still not be small. Ileana answered with the distinction the younger woman would likely remember for years. The goal was to be clear, not small, and quiet itself was optional. That moment may have mattered more than the hearing, more than Mercer's fall, more even than the salute. Vindication achieves its deepest purpose when it becomes shelter for someone else. Winter came slowly. St. Catherine's communication protocol entered onboarding. Incident escalations briefly rose, then improved in quality as staff learned that they would actually be heard. Corbett recommended Ileana for advanced trauma educator certification. Belle supported it. Priya became one of the sharpest residents in the hospital because humility reached her before prestige calcified around her. Lucas grew into the kind of doctor who listened first and spoke second, and that change probably saved more lives than anyone would ever count. Mercer left. Ileana kept the photograph by the window face up now. Sometimes after long shifts, she stood on her balcony with cooling tea in her hands while sirens moved faintly through the city and thought about the selves she no longer needed to explain. The field medic, the extraction specialist. The woman once called Marrow in places where survival depended on precision. The civilian nurse who taught frightened families how to remain steady through uncertainty. None of those selves contradicted the others. They completed them. One evening, Dana texted her a picture from the break room wall. Someone had taped up a quote from one of the training sessions. It read that specifics were harder to dismiss. Beneath it, in another hand, someone had added that quiet was not weakness. Ileana looked at the image for a long time before setting the phone down. Her apartment remained unchanged. The simple table by the window, the folded blanket, the shoes by the door, the lockbox tucked away, the life she had built by choice. There was no grand music there, no audience, no command center, no urgent classified machinery. There was only peace, and it was earned. That was the deepest truth beneath everything that had happened at St. Catherine Memorial. Mercer's humiliation was not the point, though it was deserved. Federal oversight was not the point, though it mattered. Even Rourke's public recognition was not the deepest payoff, though the image of it would live in the hospital for years. The deepest truth was that Ileana had never needed anyone's ignorance in order to become extraordinary. She already was. Their mistake had only delayed their own understanding. Humility had never been weakness. Restraint had never been emptiness. Service had never become real only when high-status people finally noticed it. The quiet person in the corner had all along been carrying a history, discipline, and depth beyond the imagination of people who only knew how to measure volume. And in the end, St. Catherine learned what institutions often learn too late. Gentleness is not fragility, silence is not absence, and the softest voice in the room may be the one that knows exactly how to keep the heart alive when everything else starts to fail.